Hello. No, but seriously, why do goths look like this? Why do I look like this? Goths don't look like this. There are loads of different kinds of goth. A lot of them don't like the word goth because it's so broad of a term. There's kind of a load of different subcultures within subcultures within subcultures. It's spread out a long way. Now, goth's been around a long time. It's sort of the history of goth and where it comes from, I feel should be a totally separate video on its own, because it's so deep of a topic, being that it's a sort of very music-based subculture. It's so deep and so broad that we don't have time for this in this video. This is just going to be a quick video of a list of sort of some of the sort of general types of goth. So let's jump right into it. So you've got your trad goth or your traditional goth. Now these guys, they're technically the birthplace of it all. They're kind of the pioneers of goth. Now they come from 1980s Britain. It's sort of an offshoot from the hardcore punk scene that was around just at the at the time and just before. I mean, these guys, they're typically characterized by the big back-combed hair and wearing all black, and you've got a sort of bit of leather and studs going on there because it's these telltale signs of coming from being an offshoot from sort of that hardcore British punk scene. Now next you've got cyber goth. Cyber goth and trad goth kind of couldn't be more polar opposite. Whereas trad goths are very sort of black and not a lot of colour there at all, really. Your cyber goths are their neon colour. They like their bright colours, and they'll mix that in with a lot of black. But a cyber goth, they can be, you're going to see typically they've got the dreads and they've got big trap pants on, and they're moving in towards the dance scene. So these guys sort of started cropping up around the 90s, especially in Britain. And these guys, they had the face masks, and they would have sort of glass goggles and things like this. And there's a few similarities, and you can see where it's going towards sort of cyberpunk with these guys. So next you've got the romance goths or the romantic goths. Now these guys, they're typically in many ways similar to trad goths, but for them it wasn't so much about the music scene. For these guys, these guys are heavily influenced by sort of literature and poems of the Gothic era. So we're moving away from the word goth as a term to describe the subculture. We're going towards the Gothic and Victorian era. Now these guys, typically they're going to wear a lot of reds, orange, purples, and it's mainly female. It's mainly sort of dominated by women. Again, these guys, they're similar to sort of trad goths, but there's a difference. So moving on from that, you've got vampire goths or just vamps. Now the kind of it is what it says with those, the clues in the name. These guys, they're very much about the vampire scene. So you typically find them walking around with veneers or fake vampire teeth on, and they're typically very suave and finely dressed. So these guys are emulating vampires of lore and the vampiric stories and your Draculas and things like that. And these guys, you can kind of fit in a little bit sort of the influences of the Morticia Adams and all of that sort of thing with those. So there's again a crossover between sort of the romantic goths and the trad goths, but they're their own separate thing. Now moving on from that, you've got a different kind, which is they're not as broadly sort of accepted as by the wider public as being goth, but you've got hippie goths. Now for these guys, it's not so much black clothing, it's not so much sort of heavy music. These guys, they come from this sort of comes from an environmental and almost a religious type sort of viewpoint for these guys. So these guys, typically there's a few sort of crossovers to your traditional hippies of the 1960s. So in the way they dress, it's not so much as bright colors, and you're not really looking at things like tie-dye. But these guys, typically they're bringing in paganism and Wiccan cultures and religions and things that are sort of bringing those around, and it's very environmental. So it's to do with the outdoors, it's to do with sort of acceptance and things with these guys. These aren't as prominent or sort of widely viewed by the outside public as goth, but some of them totally see themselves as goths. So moving on from that, again, we've got another opposite totally to your trad goths. We've got Pastel Goth, or J-Goth, sort of Japanese goth. This, as it says, comes from Japanese culture, heavily influenced by. These guys are typically wearing a lot of, you know, pinks or blues or silvers, and it's heavily influenced by the kawaii sort of fashion sense, which comes from Japan. This is relatively newer, and it's a lot more popular among sort of younger people. And I think the social media and the Instagram world is definitely sort of pulling these guys to a bit more of the forefront, because in my opinion personally, I see a lot of crossover between that and the whole e-girl, e-boy thing. And I may be opening a can of worms there, because not everyone agrees with it, but in my opinion, there's a few crossovers there. And now a relatively new one that's only just sort of cropping up. I've not met anyone who's sort of identifies as this, and I can see where some of the styles and some of the sort of influences are coming from. But this is bubble goth. Now this is coming from Estonia. It comes from an Estonian singer, and I don't remember her name, but she's popularizing this culture of, there seems to be a lot of white clothing, a lot of sort of white goth type, you know, type style fashions there. And the point of it is to sort of blur the lines between cute and creepy and cute, and to sort of make these sort of two opposing fashions mesh a little bit more. Now, these are just this isn't a full list of every type of goth or person who could be seen as goth out there. If, you know, to come up with a conclusive list of all of these things, you'd probably need a week, because there are so many different offshoots and different kinds, and people borrow little bits from each sort of different style of subculture here and there to create their own. Goth originally was a very sort of DIY, you know, homegrown. It's not store-bought, shelf-bought things. You kind of made it yourself and did it yourself. So, you know, a lot of people aren't going to identify specifically as being in one category. I certainly don't. I don't particularly class myself as goth. You know, I like dark clothing. I like sort of this whole thing, whatever this is. But if you've learned something, or if this has pointed out something, you know, that you didn't know before, perhaps smash the like button. It all helps. But perhaps you disagree. Perhaps you think that I've got this totally wrong, or maybe have I missed a few? You know, have I missed some categories? Is there something emerging that I don't really know about, or has there been a sort of mergence of one or two of these that's created its own thing that you think needs a special mention in here? Now, if that's the case, put it in the comments. I do read the comments. Other than that, one special mention quickly before you end. We're not emos. We don't like emos. That's not to throw shade at anyone out there who is emo that may be watching this, but we don't like being confused with them. Cheers.